more than a dozen unmanned platforms being tested by the Navy as part of an effort to develop the world's first big unmanned fleet of these boats.
For the first time in U.S. history, AI-controlled warships aren't stuck in safe test zones. They're out in the Pacific acting as real Navy ships, completely empty of crew.
They're able to sail safely without humans on board. They're able to operate with humans on board.
No officers on the bridge, no bunks below deck, nothing human aboard at all.
Understanding what's happening on the water, and this is where these unmanned systems and artificial intelligence can be helpful.
Just sensors and software steering through thousands of miles of open water. And what happened on that patrol stunned the Navy.
So Seagull is the only unmanned surface vehicle in the world that has actually launched a torpedo.
Why the U.S. built a warship with no one on board?
But if you do see it on the water, don't be offended if no one waves back to you because, well, there's no one on board.
For years, the U.S. Navy has had the same headache in the Pacific. A lot of countries are buying diesel-electric submarines. These subs are cheaper to build and run than nuclear subs, and at low speed they can be even quieter. They shut down their diesel engines underwater and run on batteries, which makes them very hard to hear. In shallow coastal waters, where sound bounces around, these quiet subs are even tougher to track. The Pacific is huge. To keep up, the Navy uses destroyers, patrol planes, and helicopters to chase possible submarine contacts over long distances. Every time they do that, they burn a lot of fuel, hours, and crew energy. Navy planners started asking a simple question. Instead of tying up big ships and large crews just to follow one quiet submarine, could they build a smaller ship that follows that sub on its own? That is where DARPA, the Pentagon's high-risk tech arm, stepped in. Around 2010, it launched a program called Anti-Submarine Warfare Continuous Trail Unmanned Vessel, or ACTUV. The goal was very direct: build an unmanned surface ship whose main job is to track quiet diesel-electric submarines for months at a time, at a much lower cost than using crewed ships. It had to launch from a pier, go out on its own, stay at sea for weeks or months, follow a target, and come back without anyone ever stepping on board. The result was Sea Hunter, the first full-size ACTUV ship. Sea Hunter is an unmanned trimaran, which just means it has a long center hull with two thin side hulls for stability. It is about 132 feet long and weighs around 135 tons with fuel. It can move at speeds over 30 miles per hour and has enough fuel to stay at sea for months without refueling, crossing whole oceans if needed. For a ship with no crew, that long reach is the whole point. Sea Hunter has computers that can steer, follow a route, and avoid other ships under rules that match the normal rules of the road at sea, while a small team of people watches it from shore or from another ship. Those people can change the mission or take control if something unusual happens, but they do not have to sit there turning the wheel every second. In 2016, Sea Hunter was christened in Oregon and sent to San Diego for trials. Over the next couple of years, it went through step-by-step testing. It had to prove it could launch, leave the pier, run multi-waypoint trips, and come back without a human pilot. It also had to show it could follow the international collision rules at sea by spotting other ships and taking the right turns to stay clear. During early work off San Diego, Sea Hunter ran more than 5,000 nautical miles under continuous autonomous control while observers tracked its behavior. That gave DARPA and the Navy proof that the basic idea worked. As the tests kept going, they did more than just basic driving. Sea Hunter pulled a special towed sensor called Talons to test how an unmanned ship could carry anti-submarine gear. It also ran in open ocean conditions up to moderate sea states and met or beat its goals for speed, maneuvering, and fuel use. The message was clear. This simple, crewless ship could stay out for a long time and get real work done without tying up a destroyer and its whole crew. Once Sea Hunter proved the basic concept, the Navy wanted a second ship built on the same idea but with upgrades. That second trimaran is Seahawk. It is another medium-sized unmanned surface vessel, based on the Sea Hunter design but updated and delivered to the Navy in 2021. Seahawk joined Sea Hunter in the Pacific as part of the same family, giving the Navy a pair of matching robot ships to experiment with instead of just one. At the same time, a different office in the Pentagon, the Strategic Capabilities Office, started another experiment called Ghost Fleet Overlord. Instead of building new hulls from scratch, this team took large, fast support ships from the commercial world and converted them into highly automated, unmanned surface vessels. These ships, named Ranger, Nomad, Mariner, and later Vanguard, are bigger than Sea Hunter and look more like normal workboats. The Overlord ships were built to test what happens when you push autonomy and automation into a much larger hull that can carry heavier gear, including full combat systems. One of them, Nomad, made headlines in 2021 when it traveled about 4,400 nautical miles, from the Gulf Coast through the Panama Canal to the West Coast, with 98% of that distance under autonomous control. Next, the Pacific Fleet started using these ships in real exercises, not just solo test runs. In April 2021, it ran something called Unmanned Integrated Battle Problem 21 off California. It was a big exercise where manned ships, aircraft, and undersea drones worked together with unmanned vessels. Sea Hunter and Seahawk took part as medium unmanned surface ships, operating in real-world scenarios to see how they could help with long-range sensing and tracking. The next big step was RIMPAC 2022, the huge rim of the Pacific exercise held around Hawaii every 2 years. For the first time, 4 unmanned surface vessels, Sea Hunter, Seahawk, Nomad, and Ranger, joined dozens of normal ships from many countries. During RIMPAC, they did not just cruise around for show, they carried test payloads, passed intelligence, and most importantly for planners, gathered tons of data about how unmanned ships fit into large fleet operations. At this point, the Navy still called them prototypes, but they were already working in the same waters and exercises as frontline destroyers and cruisers. All of this testing made one thing obvious. If the Navy wanted unmanned ships to actually matter, it needed a full-time group to run them every single day, not just a small project team. So in May 2022, the Pacific Fleet created Unmanned Surface Vessel Division 1, usually called USVDAV-1. Its job is to run medium and large unmanned surface ships like Sea Hunter, Seahawk, Ranger, and Mariner, plan their tests, and figure out how to fit them into normal fleet operations. USVDIV-1 started on the U.S. West Coast. It took charge of the small group of robot ships and began sending them to more complex events, including trips to Japan and Australia for exercises with allies. As the workload increased, the Navy expanded that group into a full unit called Unmanned Surface Vessel Squadron 1, based at Port Hueneme in California. Its job is to handle the daily development and training these ships need. It was another quiet signal that unmanned ships were shifting from a cool experiment to a normal part of the fleet. But building these ships was only the first step. The real test came when the Navy finally sent them into the Pacific with no crew on board. Inside the first real patrols, how AI warships learned the Pacific. In August 2023, 4 gray crewless ships left Southern California and headed west. They were Sea Hunter, Seahawk, Ranger, and Mariner. Over the next 5 months, they would circle much of the Pacific, work with carriers and destroyers, pull into foreign ports, and then come home after sailing more than 53,000 miles in total. From day one of that cruise, the goal was to see if these unmanned ships could act like real patrol assets, not just tech demos. The Navy pushed them to stay at sea for long stretches. Each ship spent up to about 50 days at a time away from port, running almost exclusively in autonomous mode, which means the onboard computers handled basic driving, while humans watched from control rooms back on shore or from nearby crewed ships. Most days at sea were not dramatic, and that is the whole point. On long legs across open water, each ship held its course and speed, shifted around bad weather, and reacted to traffic like tankers and fishing boats. Of course, these ships weren't just driving in circles. Their job was to be extra sets of eyes and ears for the rest of the fleet. Some runs were focused on anti-submarine work. Seahawk, for example, has sailed with a long-towed sonar behind it, a cable full of underwater microphones that listens for quiet submarines. During earlier tests at the big RIMPAC exercise in Hawaii in 2022, Seahawk towed that sonar while the destroyer USS Fitzgerald controlled it. Seahawk sent back information on possible underwater targets, so the crewed ships did not have to stay in one spot and babysit the sensors themselves. Sea Hunter's early sea time at RIMPAC looked different but just as useful. It carried an electronic warfare package, which means antennas and receivers to listen for radio and radar signals from far away. At RIMPAC, it worked alongside Nomad and Ranger as part of a huge multinational drill with 26 nations, 38 ships, and thousands of personnel. The unmanned ships acted like extra scout platforms, sending targeting and surveillance data over the network so commanders sitting on other ships, including foreign flagships, could see what they saw almost in real time. By the time the 4-ship Pacific deployment started in August 2023, the Navy was ready to push harder. The cruise itself was wrapped into an experiment called Integrated Battle Problem 23.2. That series of tests, run by U.S. Third Fleet under Pacific Fleet's larger plan, asked a simple question. If you put these 4 unmanned ships in the same waters as normal Navy forces for months at a time, what can they actually do for you day to day? During the deployment, Sea Hunter, Sea Hawk, Ranger, and Mariner didn't just hug the U.S. West Coast. They crossed the Pacific to Hawaii and then moved into the Western Pacific, where they worked alongside Carrier Strike Group 1, Marines from the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, and the Royal Australian Navy. A Carrier Strike Group is a big team built around an aircraft carrier, with destroyers, supply ships, and aircraft all working together. The unmanned ships operated on the edges of that team as scouts and sensor trucks, extending the group's view hundreds of miles away without risking a full crew in those positions. The cruise also included real port visits, which mattered as much for politics as for testing pier gear and refueling plans. In mid-September 2023, Ranger and Mariner pulled into Yokosuka, Japan, a major U.S. base and home port for many crewed warships. It was the first time the Navy had brought these large, unmanned surface vessels into Japan. For local sailors on the pier, seeing ghost gray ships moored with nobody walking around on deck was a clear sign that unmanned patrols were no longer a distant idea. A month later, the same pair turned up in Sydney, Australia, ahead of a drill called Autonomous Warrior, where Australian and U.S. forces tested how mixed fleets of crewed and uncrewed systems might work together. Throughout this period, the 4 ships kept slipping in and out of different major events. Each event forced the unmanned ships into new roles. Sometimes they held a fixed picket line to watch a choke point. Sometimes they pushed far ahead of the main group. And sometimes they sat in the middle of the formation, acting like floating cell towers that passed data back and forth. The deployment showed where the technology still needs work. During Integrated Battle Problem 23.2 and related operations, the Navy tracked 183 encounters where the unmanned ships had to follow the rules of the road with other vessels. More than 80% of the time, the autonomy handled the situation exactly as expected. In a slice of the rest, the move was safe, but not what human officers would have chosen. And in 14 cases, senior officers labeled the ship's behavior inappropriate, meaning the software made a choice they did not like and want to fix. In rough seas or heavy rain, the sensors sometimes mistook waves or clouds for solid objects and made the ship maneuver more than it needed to, which confused nearby crews. In other cases, an antenna blind spot or a bad radar read meant the ship was slower than a human in getting back to its planned lane after avoiding traffic. Across the deployment, there were about 157 times when people had to step in and take control for some reason, but only 48 of those were serious enough to worry engineers. That worked out to roughly 1 important intervention every 42 hours of operation, and about 1 autonomy-related issue every 4 days. By January 15, 2024, the 4 unmanned ships were back in California after that long Pacific loop. Their long Pacific cruise showed what they can do. Now it's time to look at how they think. Inside the brain, how an AI warship sees, thinks, and obeys orders. On a normal ship, you have lookouts with binoculars, radar operators watching a screen, and sonar operators listening for submarines. On an AI warship, those same senses come from hardware. The ship uses marine radar to sweep around and pick up other vessels and large objects on the surface. It has regular video cameras and thermal cameras that can spot small boats or floating junk, even in low light. The ship also listens. It can tow sonar gear behind it, or use hull-mounted sonar to hear the sound of engines and propellers in the water, which is vital if it is helping to track submarines. On top of that, it reads Automatic Identification System, or AIS, messages. AIS is a signal that most commercial ships are required to broadcast, which tells everyone nearby their name, position, speed, and course. By pulling radar returns, camera images, sonar echoes, and AIS tracks into one place, the onboard computers build a live map of the area around the ship. Who is out there, what direction they are going, and how fast they are moving. Once the ship can see, it has to move without hitting anything. Here, the software acts like a constantly thinking navigator. It starts with a goal that humans give it, such as patrol inside this box, Follow this contact at a safe distance, or stay near this other ship. Then it looks at obstacles, the shipping lanes, shallow areas, and the official collision rules of the sea. Modern research groups have shown that you can train software to handle these situations by letting it practice in a simulator thousands of times. One study used real ship tracking data to teach a neural network, basically a pattern learning program, to spot when two ships were getting too close and to pick a safe course change to avoid a crash. Another team used a method called multi-agent reinforcement learning, which is just a way of letting several simulated ships learn how to dodge each other while still obeying the rules of the sea. The point is that by the time the Navy trusts autonomy software on a real hull, that code has already been through huge numbers of what-if drills where it learns not to cut across another ship's bow, not to freeze up in a crowded channel, and not to sail into shallow water. Lethal force is where the line gets especially clear. Sea Hunter started life as an unarmed test ship, but U.S. officials have openly discussed the idea that vessels like it could one day carry weapons. At the same time, they have been very direct about who pulls the trigger. When Sea Hunter was first rolled out, Deputy Defense Secretary Robert Work said that even if weapons were added, a human would always make the decision to use lethal force, not the ship's software. The tech is impressive on its own, but its real importance becomes clear when you look at how it changes the future of the Pacific. The coming Ghost Fleet. How AI warships change the Pacific balance. Right now, the U.S. Navy is treating these AI warships as part of its future fleet, not as a science project it might cancel later. In a plan called Force Design 2045, the Navy says it wants more than 350 crewed ships and about 150 large uncrewed ships and submarines in the coming decades. That mix is often called a hybrid fleet. The reason is simple. The Navy has global commitments, the Pacific is huge, and crewed warships are very expensive. The price of a new Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is now around $2.2 billion, and there is no easy way to suddenly build dozens more and fill them with trained crews. So instead of trying to grow a classic fleet overnight, the Navy is trying to bolt uncrewed hulls onto the force it already has. Unmanned surface vessel units, like Unmanned Surface Vessel Division 1 and Unmanned Surface Vessel Squadron 1 on the U.S. West Coast, are early pieces of that plan. They exist to turn prototype ships such as Sea Hunter, Sea Hawk, Ranger, and Mariner into everyday tools and to write the playbook for whatever comes next. Analysts at Johns Hopkins and others have estimated that running a destroyer at sea can cost around $700,000 per day when you add fuel, crew pay, and maintenance. By contrast, Sea Hunter's daily operating cost has been quoted in the range of $15,000 to $20,000 per day. That is still a serious amount of money, but it is many times cheaper than sending a full-size destroyer to do basic patrol and tracking jobs. If you can send a smaller uncrewed ship to hold a patch of ocean or follow a target, you do not have to risk a billion-dollar ship and hundreds of sailors every time. This is where the idea of throwaway or expendable scouts comes in. The Navy will never use that exact word in public, but the logic is there. A large unmanned ship is still valuable, yet if one is sunk or rammed in a crisis, you have not lost a crew. That makes commanders more willing to push these hulls into dangerous spots, tight choke points, missile threat zones, or areas filled with mines. In wartime, they can take risks that officers would never accept for a frigate full of people. Of course, the United States is not alone in this. China is watching closely and is building its own unmanned fleet. In 2020, satellite photos and leaked images showed a Chinese trimaran that looked very similar to Sea Hunter, with a long center hull and two smaller side hulls. Analysts called it a Sea Hunter knockoff, and later reports showed it underway on sea trials. China has also been working on the Jerry family of armed unmanned surface vessels. Newer versions, such as the Jerry USVA, are reported to be larger, with a stealthy hull, a radar mast, and space for weapons including guns and missile launchers. This matters because China already has the world's largest navy by ship count. If it adds swarms of cheap unmanned boats and larger missile-carrying USVs to that number, it could swarm around islands, ports, or straits in the Western Pacific, making it harder for manned U.S. ships to move without being watched or threatened. For U.S. planners, fielding their own ghost fleet is partly about keeping up in this numbers game. If China can put unmanned ships off Guam or near key sea lanes, the United States wants its own AI-controlled hulls forward-based in places like Hawaii, Guam, and allied ports in the region, so it is not always reacting from far away. While the Pacific gets most of the attention, some of the most aggressive unmanned experiments are actually happening in other regions, and those lessons are feeding back into Pacific plans. In the Middle East, the U.S. Fifth Fleet set up Task Force 59 in 2021. The job of this group is to blend unmanned systems and artificial intelligence with regular naval forces. By late 2022, the Navy said TF-59 had tested and operated more than 23 different unmanned platforms, including wind-powered sail drone explorers that can stay at sea for more than a year on wind and solar power. The goal there is to cover busy waters like the Gulf with lots of cheap, persistent sensors, then stitch that data together using AI so commanders see threats earlier. All of this promise comes with real risks. One big fear is cyber attack. An unmanned warship is basically a floating network of computers, radios, and satellite links. Studies on maritime cybersecurity have shown that many ship systems, like satellite terminals and navigation networks, can be hacked or tricked if they are not properly protected. In some tests, researchers found that attackers could send false signals to a ship and confuse its GPS, or use weak satellite links to inject malicious code that could shut down or mislead key systems. For a crewed ship, a human can notice that something is wrong and take manual control. On an unmanned ship, if the software and the link are both compromised, the vessel could be blinded, led off course, or even turned into a threat. There is also the risk of miscalculation at sea. In 2022, in the Middle East, Iranian forces tried to tow away U.S. unmanned surface vessels on at least 2 occasions, forcing U.S. ships and helicopters to step in and demand their return. Those incidents did not turn into open fights, but they show the problem. If a rival navy rams or seizes an unmanned warship, is that the same as attacking a crewed ship? Does it justify a military response? These are not settled questions, and yet the hardware is already in the water. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.